So I can't tell you how much I enjoyed reading the discussion on fairy tales this week. Not only the people who say this is my genre, this is the thing I love, but people who were struggling with some of the stories not being as coherent as you would expect a story to be, some of the violence, some of the difficulty in accessing themes. I do want to remind you that accessing themes in these fairy tales is not accessing a teachable moral. That's not what we're looking for when we're looking for themes. We're looking for what is the human thing that is compelling about this, because all of these fairy tales and folk tales were passed down from generation to generation over decades, over hundreds of years, some of them over thousands of years. And you have to ask yourself, why, when people started telling that story, did people put everything down and listen? What was the thing in there that was captivating or compelling? It's not about what lesson it was trying to teach us about how to be good people and so on. That's not why people listen to stories. So there is this sense that fairy tales and folk tales are our genre as educators. And there are people out there who love fairy tales maybe a little bit more than educators tend to in the field of literature and just people who love reading. But I would like to put out there the idea that there's probably nobody who reads or tells more of these tales per year than educators do. We probably put more fairy tale collections in kids' hands or individual fairy tales than anybody else that's out there. So on that level, this is our genre. We should know it better than anybody else. So if it's not your favorite thing, then you still need to be prepared to be the supplier, because these are compelling stories, which means that you need to know how to give kids the good stuff instead of the microwaved stuff, the stuff that's been retooled and isn't as compelling as it could have been. As you push forward with that, there are a few things that I want to get out there. One of them that I didn't mention before we started the unit is that there are literary fairy tales and there are folk tales. Folk tales are passed on by word of mouth from person to person, from generation to generation. Now, that doesn't mean that the folk tales that get spread around didn't come from books. We find that many of the fairy tales that people thought came from just word of mouth being spread over time, you can actually go back in time and find an original literary fairy tale, but people who heard that story, who may not have been able to read, loved the story enough that they passed it down by word of mouth, generation to generation. That person-to-person, generation-to-generation process is folk. That's what folk means. Literary fairy tales were written by somebody, they submitted it to a publisher, they got paid for it. And it's mass media. It's thousands of copies being distributed of the story, and it's a completely different process than folk process. So literary fairy tales are great as literature, but they don't tell us the same thing anthropologically about a folk, about a people. So they don't have that same impact that we look for in folk tales when we're talking about access to what the people of a culture think and believe. So that's why at the heart of all of this, the recommendation that I have for you is get authentic original collections as much as you can. Use that handout from Elliot Singer, World Folk Tales. Not all of those are folk tales. Some of them are literary fairy tales. I know that the Hans Christian Andersen and the Rudyard Kipling, Just So Stories, those are all on there. But all of the great collections of world folk tales are on here. So in reading the discussions, I did get the sense that if you decide to take on the entire world with this, it's too much. That figuring out how to decide what's authentic and what's not does take some research. So I'm just going to tell you, if you want to get good at knowing what's authentic, pick one culture. Decide on the culture that you want to spend time on and spread that out. Make a year of it. Give kids access to it. Use your read-alouds for it. Find versions and variants. Bring them on and just make that part of your classroom library and promote it. Get kids helping you over the course of a school year to decide what's authentic here and what's not quite as authentic. if you want a clear sense for some theory, I heard a lot of theory being discussed by you, and this is practical theory. If you want to dig in deeper on what the term folklore means, go to Elliot Singer's source, which is Richard Dorson. Richard Dorson was a folklorist for many decades, and his work involved the coining of the term fake lore, which he saw becoming prolific in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and he called people out on it and said we shouldn't be doing this because it's damaging to people's image of the folk. A couple of other people I want to mention to you. Jack Zipes, Z-I-P-E-S. He has the top collection of Grimm's fairy tales that's out there. I think it's called The Original Tales of the Brothers Grimm. Just came out in a new edition, and it has hundreds of these tales, not just 50 of them like the one we bought. I encourage you to get the Dover edition just because it's got a lot of them in there, and it gives us this great introduction. But if you want to dig deeper into the Grimm's tales, you've got to get Jack Zipes' book. Jack Zipes is also one of the top academics on and translators of fairy tales, so you can find out more about fairy tales and understanding them from him than almost anybody else. He's also even written a great feminist book that tells us about the fairy tales and folk tales that feature the strong female characters or have a gender-bending aspect to them and so on. Parallel to that, because you were discussing gender in some of your discussions, Bronwyn Davies, D-A-V-I-E-S, wrote a book called Frogs and Snails and Feminist Tales in the 1990s. This is a great overview of gender in the traditional fairy tales. A couple more people. Andrew Teverson just recently wrote a book called Fairy Tale, where he outlines very clearly for us what is this genre, what does it mean for a tale to be called a fairy tale. The last one is Bruno Bettelheim, who was a psychoanalyst who wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment. He got in a lot of trouble a lot of years later because he ended up faking a lot of his stuff with the psychoanalysis. But his book is a brilliant analysis of how the human elements inside of folk and fairy tales get to the heart of our human insecurities, our fears, and our difficulties in being human. And he supposedly used a lot of these stories to help kids understand their neuroses and so on. The last thing I'd like to turn you on to is a newer collection of fairy tales called The Turnip Princess. Look that up on Amazon if you enjoyed the Grimm fairy tales. This is another collection of less well-known tales that never got put together by the Brothers Grimm, or they were put together but weren't put together in the later collections. So it's a gathering of folk and fairy tales that we may not have seen before. So think about all of these things. If you decide on a culture that you'd like to study, you can go deep into authenticity. The last thing to mention here is that in almost every culture, there are storytelling rights. There are certain people who get that longer turn, and this can be crossing all different sorts of or areas of a culture, so it's not like some people can't tell any stories. But if you think about the types of stories that there are out there, the myth stories, for example, inside of a culture, there tend to be people who are curators of those myth stories, and tinkering with those stories to put them in a children's picture book is far more damaging because you're taking rights where you don't really have rights. If you go down to just little stories about animals or everyday personal stories, people can just tell those kinds of stories, and so manipulating those stories a little bit and tinkering with them may not be as damaging. So think about that question of storytelling rights as a key aspect of deciding what's authentic. When you're really dealing with a culture's mythology, you want to get it right because you're representing what they believe, and you have this high risk of making an entire culture seem quaint or even stupid if you put their myth stories out there without the context that they need. And if you change them at all, you've really messed things up. So think about that. You can do authenticity, but it's going to take a particular type of focus. All right.